It seems like history was written a long time ago. But why do the same questions come up again and again? Why is everything smooth in textbooks, but there are gaps in excavations, documents, and myths? Some civilizations disappear without a trace. Others seem to come out of nowhere. Sometimes it even seems like someone deliberately erased their traces or hid them. These 20 mysteries changed my view of everything I knew about the past. Hi friend, you are on the KirTop channel. The Disappearance of Atlantis. Atlantis is more than just an ancient legend. It is a cultural phantom that still influences minds, dreams, and even science. Plato described it in astonishing detail. A huge island with a highly developed civilization, a powerful army, and a complex system of canals. He claimed that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, opposite the Atlantean mountains, and sank underwater as a result of a powerful earthquake in one day, around 9,500 BC. More than 11,000 years have passed since then, and we are still arguing. Did it exist? They searched for it in Crete and Santorini, Cuba and Brazil, Iceland, and at the bottom of the Atlantic. Scientists have proposed hundreds of theories, from the catastrophe at Tyre to a distorted memory of a sunken part of the Sahara. The problem is that we do not have a single direct archaeological proof. No artifacts, no remains, no genetic trace, but science cannot completely disprove the existence of Atlantis. The strangest thing is the scale of its influence. The legend of Atlantis has given rise to entire schools of philosophy, occult theories, Nazi mystics, pseudosciences, conspiracy theorists, and science fiction writers have been based on it. Atlantis has become a symbol of a lost golden age. It attracts because it is not just a vanished land, it is the idea that we were once more than we are now. Sometimes I think that Atlantis is not a sunken island, but a reflection of our dreams. We want to believe that people were once stronger, smarter, better. And until we learn the truth, this story will come up again and again. The Great Flood, myth or catastrophe? The story of the Great Flood is one of the most universal in world culture. It is known not only from the Bible, where Noah builds an ark, but also from the Sumerian epic about Ziusudra, the Babylonian story of Utnapishtim, the Indian myth of Manu, the Greek story of Deucalion, Chinese chronicles, legends of the American Indians, and even Arctic tales. Such a coincidence is almost impossible to consider accidental. This makes you wonder, maybe the flood really happened, and if so, when? One of the most convincing hypotheses suggests an event about 7,600 years ago. Then, due to a sharp rise in the level of the world ocean, salt water gushed through the Bosphorus into the Black Sea lowland. Geologists claim that the water level rose by 140 meters, flooding huge territories. What used to be fertile land became a sea. This event could really look like the end of the world for the peoples of that era. But was it a global flood? Probably not. However, for specific people living in river floodplains, in lowlands, near the coasts, this was a global catastrophe. Imagine, water takes everything. A house, cattle, land, village, ancestors. People save themselves on rafts, go to the mountains. Centuries later, the memory of what happened turns into a myth, universal and terrible. It amazes me how this ancient fear still lives in us. Even in the 21st century, we are afraid of floods. Talk about a climate catastrophe, as if we genetically remember how the world once really drowned. And perhaps this is not just a myth, it is a warning. Who built the pyramids? They have been standing for over 4,500 years. Hundreds of tons of stone, millions of blocks, perfectly calibrated angles. The majestic, alien-like pyramids of Giza remain a symbol of eternity and mystery. But the main question is simple: how? Modern archaeology offers different versions. According to one, the blocks were cut in quarries and delivered to the construction site using sleds and wet sand. According to another, the blocks were made right on site from a mixture of limestone and clay. Essentially, it was ancient concrete. French engineer Joseph Davidovits even presented his formula for geopolymer stone. And still, even taking these hypotheses into account, we do not have an exact answer. It is not only a matter of technology. The mystery is in the scale. It would have taken about 2.3 million blocks to build the Cheops pyramid. Even with an ideal organization of labor, this would have taken tens of years and thousands of workers. Now remember, this was the ancient world. No wheeled cranes, no steel, no electricity. and yet the internal shafts are aligned to the centimeter, and the orientation of the pyramid's sides almost perfectly matches the 4 cardinal directions. And then there are other questions. Why were such tombs needed? Why are all 3 Giza pyramids built at the same angles as the stars of Orion's belt? Why do some blocks show signs of processing that look more like melting than cutting? The more I read about the pyramids, the more I feel these are not just buildings, they are messages. They were not built just for the dead, they were built for the future, for us. And until we understand exactly how they were built, we will not understand why. The mystery of Stonehenge. Stonehenge is like a puzzle made of stone. It has been standing on Salisbury Plain for over 4,000 years. The giant stones are arranged in a circle with inner and outer rings. Some of them weigh up to 25 tons. Some were brought from hundreds of kilometers away. How? Why? Who did it? Scientists are still arguing. Some say it was a Druid sanctuary. Others believe that the complex was built long before the Celts arrived, about 1,000 years ago. There is also a theory that it was an ancient observatory. After all, certain stones are indeed aligned in the direction of the solstices, but even if this is true, why was such a scale needed? The problem is that we have almost no written sources from that time. We can only guess. But one thing is definitely amazing: the engineering precision. The stones stood vertically, overlapped by horizontal blocks, creating portals. This requires not only strength, but also knowledge. But this was not a developed city, but in fact a field. Without metal, without blueprints, without technology. What's even stranger is that in the 20th century, Stonehenge was reconstructed. Some stones were put back in place using cranes. It turns out that we are still not sure which stones were in their places and which have already been moved. This adds even more fog to an already confusing story. The Giants of Easter Island. Easter Island is a tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but it is there that hundreds of stone giants, the Moai, stand. Their faces are turned inward, as if they were guarding the island. The largest ones reach 10 meters in height and weigh up to 80 tons. And most importantly, no one knows exactly how they were made or why. It is believed that the Moai were carved by local people, the Rapa Nui, around the 11th to 16th centuries. They used stone axes, wooden levers, and ropes. Some scientists have tried to repeat this process, and they even succeeded, but only with relatively small statues. What to do with those that weighed tens of tons? How were they moved around the island, given that there are no trees for strong logs on Easter Island? Thor Heyerdahl suggested that the statues were dragged lying down. Another theory says that they were swinged from side to side like a refrigerator on ropes. But there are still questions here, especially about how the statues were given hats, pukau, which weigh up to 2 tons and stand on top. It is almost impossible to lift them without cranes. There is another question: why? Some believe that these were portraits of ancestors. Some that the Moai symbolized the strength of the clan. But the island is small. There were almost no resources on it. Why did the entire population spend energy on these stone heads? A lonely island without trees, without iron, with mysterious statues that seem to be watching you. I can't help but think that this was a ritual not for people, but for someone who was supposed to see these statues from the sky or from the sea. Where did the Mayans disappear to? The Mayans left behind incredible things: cities carved out of the jungle, temples resembling stepped pyramids, complex writing, and precise astronomical calculations. Their calendars were so accurate that they are still debated. But by the time the Spaniards arrived, only small settlements in the forest remained of the great civilization. No army, no power, no temples. What happened? Scientists have put forward dozens of versions. The most common is an ecological catastrophe. The Mayans cut down too much forest, the soil became depleted, and a drought began. Combined with overpopulation and internal conflicts, this could have led to collapse. There is also a theory of epidemics. Some talk about internecine wars between city-states. Even an alien trace is mentioned in conspiracy circles. The disappearance of an entire culture seems so strange. But what is especially important, the Mayans did not disappear completely. The descendants of this civilization still live in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize. They speak Mayan languages, preserve traditions, customs, costumes. It's just that the state model that we call the Mayan civilization collapsed. And it collapsed suddenly. The cities were empty, power disappeared, writing was forgotten over time. When you look at their stone cities covered in moss, you get the feeling that all this happened very recently, as if they went deep into the jungle and will return someday. Not as a tribe, but as a culture that again has something to say to the world. Who were the Sumerians? We are used to thinking that history begins with Egypt, but if we look deeper, it turns out that the first great civilization was not the Egyptians at all, but the Sumerians. They were the ones who built the first cities, created the first writing, made complex calculations, studied astronomy, medicine, irrigation, and even drew up laws. They seem to be from another time, but who they were still remains a mystery. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia around the 4th millennium BC, and immediately as a highly organized society. There are no traces of their gradual development, as if they came with ready-made knowledge. They had a complex language that was unlike any other. Even family ties with other languages of the world have not been found. Hence the question, where are they from? There are versions that the Sumerians came from the east, perhaps from the mountainous regions of Iran or Pakistan. In their language, the words country and mountain are denoted by the same thing. This may be a hint, but there are also more exotic theories. For example, that the Sumerians brought their knowledge from a sunken continent or were contactees with extraterrestrial beings. Of course, there is no evidence for these versions, but the oddities remain. What personally surprises me is the amount of knowledge they possessed. They didn't just build houses, they knew how to strengthen the foundation. They didn't just write, they kept accounts. They didn't just observe the stars, they predicted lunar eclipses. They were rational, civilized, and yet they disappeared. At some point, the Sumerians dissolved into other peoples. Their language disappeared, and all that remained were cuneiform tablets and scattered guesses. Where did the Neanderthals go? They lived in Europe and Asia long before us. Strong, hardy, well adapted to the cold. We are used to thinking that Neanderthals were some kind of dumb cavemen, but this is not true at all. They had a larger brain than us. They made tools, used fire, buried the dead, took care of the wounded. There is evidence that they played primitive flutes and decorated themselves with shells. Neanderthals were not animals. They were a full-fledged human species, almost like us. But about 40,000 years ago, they disappeared, and it is still unclear why. There are 3 main versions. Assimilation, they mixed with the Cro-Magnons, and now part of their genes lives in us. Genocide, our ancestors destroyed them in the fight for resources. And the climate, a sharp cold snap began, which the Neanderthals could not cope with because they did not make clothes and did not build houses. Most likely, everything at once. Some died, some disappeared into us. To this day, our genome contains from 1% to 4% of Neanderthal DNA, especially in Europeans and Asians. But what does this mean? Memory or oblivion? One thing touches me in this story. They were almost like us, but something prevented them from surviving. Forgotten rulers of Egypt. Most of us think of Egypt as an eternal civilization, strong, proud, independent. But there was a time when it was ruled by outsiders. They were called the Hyksos. This word means rulers of foreign lands or shepherd kings. Who they really were is still a matter of debate. The Hyksos invaded Egypt around the 17th century BC, and they didn't just destroy the country, they subjugated it. They founded a dynasty, ruled for almost a century, and introduced new technologies. They are believed to have brought the war chariot to Egypt. This changed the entire strategy of warfare in the Middle East. There is also evidence that the Hyksos were the first to actively use bronze and composite weapons on Egyptian territory. Where they came from is a mystery. Some believe that they came from Canaan, modern Levant, others that they were nomadic tribes from Asia. Some researchers suggest that the Hyksos were a mixture of different peoples, traders, warriors, herders, who united on a wave of migrations and wars, but their culture did not survive in its pure form. We know about them mainly from Egyptian sources and therefore with a strong tinge of hostility. After the expulsion of the Hyksos, the Egyptians began a new era, the 18th dynasty, the same one in which Tutankhamun was. Perhaps it was hatred for the enslavers that made Egypt become a great power again. But at the same time, some of the Hyksos' achievements were preserved and became part of the Egyptian tradition. I am always captivated by such moments when the victors not only forget the vanquished but also take the best from them. Where did the Scythians disappear to? The Scythians are one of those peoples that everyone has heard of but knows almost nothing about. The Greeks described them as wild horsemen from the north, living without cities but mastering the art of war. Herodotus devoted an entire part of his works to them. And then, silence. At some point, the Scythians simply disappear from history. At the height of their power, they controlled vast territories, from the Danube to the Altai. They traded with the Greeks, fought with the Persians, fought with Alexander the Great, and later with the Sarmatians and Huns. Their culture was bright and unique: burial mounds, gold jewelry, animal style and art, a special attitude to death. And suddenly, an abrupt end. No chronicles, no clear evidence of what happened to them. Historians suggest that the Scythians dissolved into other peoples. Some say into the Sarmatians. Some people believe that the descendants of the Scythians are the Ossetians, Chechens, and Ingush. But all of this is just a hypothesis. There is no direct evidence. What particularly touches me is their burial mounds. You stand on a hill in the steppe, and under your feet, thousands of years ago, someone buried a leader, with weapons, with gold, with a horse. Everything is neatly laid out, as if the person had not died, but had simply set off on a long journey. And then you look at it and understand. It is not just an army or people that has disappeared. A whole view of the world has disappeared. Powerful, swift, nomadic, with its own logic and its own truth. The disappearance of the 10 tribes of Israel. This is one of the most mysterious and little discussed topics in history. At the end of the 8th century BC, almost the entire ancient Israeli state disappeared. The Assyrians captured the northern kingdom of Israel, and with it 10 of the 12 tribes that made up the people disappeared. In fact, 5/6 of the population. Where did they go? Historical chronicles report that after the conquest, the Assyrians forcibly resettled the Israelites to Mesopotamia, to the areas of today's Iran and Afghanistan. That's where the trail ends. The people disappeared from the historical map. More than 2,000 years have passed, and during this time they have become something of a myth. They were searched for all over the world. In India, in Iran, in the Caucasus region, in Japan, there is even a Makuya movement whose followers are convinced that the Japanese imperial family is of Jewish origin. The very word Mikado, in their opinion, comes from Mi Gadol, great. Some see the Afghan Pashtuns as descendants of the Israelites. Others see them as North American Indians. But none of these versions have been accepted. There is no exact genetic link, no written evidence, no archaeological trace. There is only a legend and a desire to find those who once left and never return. Who discovered America before Columbus? When we hear discovery of America, we almost automatically think of 1492 and Columbus's ships. But more and more often, arguments are being made that Europeans had been to the New World long before him, especially the Vikings. The protagonist of this alternative history is Bjarni Herjulfsson, a Scandinavian merchant. At the end of the 10th century, he was blown off course by a storm and, according to him, saw a green land to the west. He did not land, but told about it. A few years later, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, went in search and found Vinland. This is believed to be part of the coast of Canada. In 1960, in L'Anse aux Meadows, Newfoundland, the remains of a Scandinavian settlement were found. Houses, a forge, nails, direct evidence. But official history ignored this data for a long time. Why? Perhaps because it is more convenient when the discovery is associated with one date and one hero, and not with a sailor's mistake in an abandoned village. But the mysteries do not end there. There are theories that even before the Vikings, the American coast was visited by the Phoenicians, Basques, Celts, and Chinese. True, the evidence is extremely controversial. Only the story with the Vikings stands firm. Only it is still perceived as something secondary, like yes, they visited, but there was no use. Where was the cradle of the Indo-Europeans? We speak Indo-European languages. Most of the languages of Europe, Iran, and India are one huge family. They have a common root, but where did it come from? Where was that starting point? The cradle from which the ancestors of the Slavs, Celts, Greeks, Hindus, and Germans then diverged. For a long time, it was believed that everything began in India, hence the term Indo-European. But later, scientists realized that there were too few language branches in India. But in the steppes of Eastern Europe, on the contrary, there was linguistic diversity. This is called the law of the center of distribution. The closer to the source, the more options. Today, one of the most recognized theories is the steppe hypothesis. According to it, the Indo-Europeans appeared about 4,500 years ago in the south of Russia and Ukraine in the area of the Yamnaya culture. They were nomads who knew how to tame horses, used carts, and owned metal. They spread west to Europe and east to Asia, bringing with them not only words but also culture, technology, and customs. And yet, despite archaeology, linguistics, and genetics, we don't have a single answer. There's the Anatolian hypothesis that the original homeland was in Asia Minor. There's the Iranian theory. There's even an idea that it all started in the Balkans. What gets me about this topic is how easily we lose the threads of origin. We know where the iPhone came from, but we don't know where the word mother came from. We can describe the process of 19th century colonization in detail, but we can't say for sure where the words that billions of people speak today came from. Maybe the question isn't where exactly that cradle was, but why we lost it, and why we're still trying to find ourselves in language. What caused the Great Migration of Peoples? 4th to 5th centuries AD, the map of Europe begins to fall apart. Waves of settlers descend on the Roman Empire. Visigoths, Huns, Vandals, Alans, Franks. The great empire, which had maintained order for centuries, collapses before our eyes. What would later be called the Middle Ages begins. And with it, the Age of Fog. What triggered this movement of peoples? The official version is a combination of factors: climate cooling, crop failures, population growth, internal conflicts. New tribes were looking for land, resources, security. But why did it all happen at the same time all over Eurasia? Why did the Germans, Slavs, and steppe dwellers all start moving? What was the trigger? There is a theory that it all started with the Huns, a military people from Central Asia who, like a chain reaction, pushed other tribes to the west. Other researchers believe that it goes deeper. Perhaps an ecological catastrophe occurred in Asia, which caused entire cultures to be uprooted. There is even a suggestion that changes in the Earth's magnetic field could have affected animal migrations, and people followed them. The Romans could not withstand the onslaught. Their roads, walls, and legions could not stop those who came not so much to fight as to survive. The empire disappeared, and another Europe arose in its place, feudal, religious, fragmented. But without this migration, there would be no France, Germany, or Russia. We literally live on the ruins of Rome and on the bones of that ancient storm. The plague and its route. 14th century. Europe freezes in horror. The Black Death is rapidly spreading across cities and villages. People are dying in the thousands. Doctors put on masks with beaks. Families disappear in a few days. And most importantly, no one understands what is happening. Today we know it was the plague. But even with modern knowledge, questions remain. Why did it strike almost exactly along the same routes as Justinian's pandemic 1,000 years earlier? Why did outbreaks occur almost simultaneously in London, Moscow, Paris? How could the plague move so quickly, given that the speed of movement in the Middle Ages was extremely low? The culprit is usually considered to be the black rat flea. It carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, but the range of wild rats did not cover the entire northern Europe. And most importantly, these rodents, in theory, could not appear in dozens of cities at once. Some scientists even believe that it was not the rats that were the problem, but the air, climate change, humidity, dust waves that could carry the infection. There is also a theory that the disease was transmitted faster, not because of biology, but because of psychology. Panic, mass exodus, flight. Infected people moved to new places, not even knowing that they were bringing death with them. As a result, the epidemic behaved not like a wave, but like a network. It ignited in many places at once, like outbreaks on dry grass. What scares me about this story is not so much the disease itself, but how it repeats itself. We think that everything has changed since then: medicine, hygiene, science. But pandemics still outpace common sense. Perhaps this is not only about microbes, perhaps it is a mirror of society. The more connections, the more vulnerable the system. And every time we begin to forget, something comes that reminds us again: the past is closer than it seems. King Arthur, a myth on the throne. They have been writing about him since the 12th century. They make films about him, write novels, draw comics. King Arthur is an almost mythological figure. The Round Table, the Sword in the Stone, Merlin, Camelot. But behind all these legends, there remains the main question. Was he real? Historians are still arguing. Some believe that Arthur is a collective image, the leader of the Celtic resistance to the Anglo-Saxons, about whom a heroic epic was composed centuries later. Others are sure that he is a completely fictional character, a literary construct. The problem is that sources about him appear too late. The first mentions are 300 to 400 years after the supposed era of his life. There are versions that the prototype of Arthur was a Roman military leader who remained in Britain after the legions left. Someone points to a possible connection with a leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus, but there is no direct evidence. No grave, no chronicles, no reliable descriptions of contemporaries. What's interesting is something else. In the legends about Arthur, almost everything is about morality, about duty, honor, truth, the fight for justice. This is not just a king, this is an idea of what a king should be. Perhaps that is why the image of Arthur is so tenacious, because it is not about a specific person, but about what we all lack. The death of Alexander. Alexander the Great conquered half the world by the age of 30. His army marched from Greece to India. He never lost a single battle. He destroyed empires and created new ones. But in 323 BC, in the prime of his life, he suddenly died in Babylon. He was only 32 years old. What happened? There are many versions. The Persians said it was punishment for desecrating the tomb of King Cyrus. The Macedonians said that he simply overstrained himself. Drunkenness, illness, overwork. Roman historians believe that he was poisoned. There is a version that it was malaria or West Nile fever, or an autoimmune disease, or a slow-acting poison delivered from the east. But the most questions are not raised by the cause of death, but by what happened after. Where is his body? According to one version, the sarcophagus was taken to Egypt. According to another, it never arrived. Then the trail is lost. No tomb, no inscription, no official burial. For the ancient world, this is an almost impossible absurdity. Such a person should have been deified, but instead, silence. Some suggest that the body was hidden on purpose, to avoid fueling a cult, to prevent legitimacy for the heirs, or because his death was part of a conspiracy and someone wanted to remove all traces. Sometimes the worst secrets are not how a person lived, but how he died. Alexander was left with fame, cities with his name, and a myth. But there was no period, no cross, no mausoleum, only guesses. And this makes his death even more legendary and disturbing. The Zars Gold. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire owned the largest gold reserves in the world, more than 1,300 tons, in bars, coins, state vaults, and the imperial treasury. After the revolution, all of this disappeared, literally, from the hands of the Romanovs into nowhere. What happened to this gold? Part of the treasure, as they say, fell into the hands of Kolchak, an admiral of the White Army. He took the gold in trains across Siberia to use it to fight the Bolsheviks. But then complete confusion begins. One train was cut off by the Reds, another was stopped by the Japanese, a third was plundered by the Czechoslovaks, a fourth, it is not clear at all whether it existed. Some amounts ended up in banks in Japan, China, France, but not all. A huge part, hundreds of tons, disappeared. According to one version, the gold was hidden in the Siberian ridges and still lies somewhere in the taiga. Another version says that it was taken abroad via Vladivostok and secretly sold. A third version says that the gold simply dissolved in the chaos of the Civil War, partly stolen, partly destroyed, partly disappeared in shadow operations. It is interesting that since then, new information has regularly appeared in Russia. Someone found a map or an eyewitness testimony, or a secret hiding place was allegedly opened. But there has been no official confirmation. The Zars Gold has become a national ghost. It amazes me how billions simply disappear, literally, without a trace, and not in antiquity, but just 100 years ago. We know who sat on the throne, what he ate for breakfast, what decrees he signed, but we don't know where the metal that held the empire together lies. The Templars Treasures. The Templars were not just knights, they were a financial empire of the Middle Ages. They had castles, ships, a treasury, their own banks, and even their own transfer system. The French king Philip IV owed them a huge sum. And then suddenly, he outlawed the order. They were arrested, tried, tortured, and most importantly, their treasures disappeared. Officially, nothing valuable was found during the seizure of the Templars' Paris headquarters. No gold, no artifacts, no documents. The treasury was empty. This caused panic and a lot of rumors. How so? Where is everything? They said that a few hours before the raid, a caravan left Paris and delivered the gold to the port of La Rochelle. From there, by ship, to an unknown destination. Since then, one of the most persistent historical quests begins. Find the Templars' gold. Some are looking for it in Scotland, others on Oak Island in Canada, where an ingenious cache with traps was allegedly built. Some believe that the treasure was transported to Switzerland and became the basis of the future banking system. There is even a theory that the gold was hidden in Jerusalem and is still guarded. The fact is that we do not even know the approximate amount of the loss. Given the scale of the order, it could have been thousands of kilograms of gold, relics, documents, political secrets. All this disappeared in an instant, and there are no traces. Personally, it seems to me that this is not just a story about treasures. This is a story about a force that became too independent and was destroyed. And the gold, it went along with the influence. And maybe it still works, only in other hands. Who paid for the revolution? 1917. The Russian Empire collapses. Power passes to the Bolsheviks. Lenin, Trotsky, new slogans, new orders. Everything seems spontaneous. The will of the people, the uprising of the masses. But one question still remains without a clear answer. Who paid for it? It is officially believed that the Bolsheviks were financed through party fees, donations, and help from sympathizers. But this does not explain the volumes. Publishing newspapers, renting buildings, weapons, logistics, transporting leaders, security. All this requires money, big money. Where did it come from? There is a version about funding from Germany. They say that the Kaiser's general staff wanted to destabilize Russia and thereby withdraw it from the war. Lenin was allegedly given money. A sealed carriage from Switzerland was organized and security was provided. This version is confirmed by many indirect sources, but there are no direct documents, or they were destroyed. Another theory talks about the West. Wall Street bankers, the English, the Old Believers. They say that the revolution was beneficial to those who wanted to bring down the old order and invest in a new one, controlled chaos. There are even names: Jacob Schiff, Olaf Aschberg, Morgenthau. But again, there is little evidence. Everything falls apart into hints and coincidences. The strangest thing is, 100 years later, we cannot say for sure how one of the largest political transformations of the century was financed. We know who walked the streets, who seized the palaces, but we do not know who printed leaflets and paid for the trains. Maybe the revolution is not only a struggle of ideas, but also invisible money, and those who know how to bet on the future. I don't know which of these secrets is the most important, but I do know one thing. Real history is not the one in textbooks. It bursts out from scraps, from random finds, from strange coincidences, and maybe we won't find all the answers. But if we at least start asking the right questions, that will change something. Thanks for watching. Bye, everyone.